The story of Germany's downfall in the Second World War did not begin with the final explosion of artillery in Berlin, nor with the thunder of Allied bombers overhead. It began much earlier, in moments so quiet and concealed that no civilian of the time could have recognized them. The first signs of collapse emerged not on any battlefield, but in the minds of the very men expected to deliver victory. Long before the world saw smoke rising from ruined cities, long before Hitler's final days in the bunker, many German commanders had already reached a private understanding that could never be spoken aloud. They were fighting a war they no longer believed could be won. The shift was not immediate. It grew slowly, almost invisibly, at a pace that matched the course of the war itself. The early years of Germany's military campaigns had been intoxicating, especially to officers who had spent the interwar period studying maneuvers on maps and dreaming of restoring the nation's old prestige. For those men, the lightning advances across Europe seemed to confirm every theory, every lecture, every boast whispered in military academies. Poland fell with shocking speed. Norway and Denmark were seized before many people realized the invasion had begun. France, which had once humiliated Germany, collapsed in a matter of weeks. The Balkan states fell one after another. The Wehrmacht stood at the height of its power, and inside command tents and briefing rooms, the atmosphere was almost euphoric. Yet, even at the peak of success, there were the faintest murmurs of concern. Concerns drowned out by triumph, but concerns nonetheless. A few cautious voices warned that the victories had come too easily, that the machine driving these triumphs was being stretched far beyond its design. But caution rarely thrives in the glow of victory. In those early days, few could imagine that the seeds of defeat had already been planted. Nothing illustrated this more than the launch of the invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941. Officers who had once witnessed the grinding battles of the First World War watched as German armored columns surged deep into Russian territory at a pace that made even seasoned veterans blink in disbelief. Entire Soviet formations disappeared, and hundreds of thousands of prisoners marched westward under German guard. It appeared, on paper and in propaganda, that the greatest conquest in modern history was underway. But the front was impossibly wide, stretching across landscapes that seemed endless. Fuel shortages immobilized vehicles that were supposed to be the spearheads of the offensive. Infantry, exhausted and undersupplied, struggled across muddy roads that devoured trucks and horses alike. In many places, troops reached points so far ahead of their supply chains that their victories became burdens. Officers in the field wrote reports filled with warnings that were quietly filed away and ignored. The war was expanding faster than the army could sustain. By the time snow settled over the Russian plains at the end of 1941, those early warning signs could no longer be dismissed. For the first time in the war, Germany's seemingly unstoppable advance halted. Equipment froze in place. Men shivered in trenches without proper winter gear. And then the unimaginable happened. Soviet forces counterattacked outside Moscow. A stunned German officer corps realized not only that the Red Army had survived, but that it had been holding back fresh divisions in reserve. The myth of a quick victory vanished overnight. In their dugouts during that first Russian winter, officers who had once laughed at the idea of defeat now found themselves whispering the very questions they feared most. Had they underestimated their enemy? Had they stretched their army too far? Was the war they had promised their soldiers, a short, decisive conflict, transforming into the same drawn-out exhaustion they had sworn would never repeat? When spring returned, Hitler demanded new offensives. He wanted fresh triumphs, bold new movements, a restoration of momentum. Many generals obeyed out of habit, but privately they harbored doubts sharper than ever before. The plan that sent armies towards Stalingrad and the Caucasus divided German strength in ways the commanders knew were reckless. Some protested, but objections were met with fury. A single man, isolated in his own inflexible vision, dictated a strategy that ignored every warning from the field. The battle for Stalingrad became the breaking point. Street by street, brick by brick, German soldiers fought in a city that refused to fall. Officers reported shortages of ammunition, food, and medical supplies. They described an enemy who fought with a determination bordering on fanaticism. When Soviet forces encircled the Sixth Army, the shock rippled through every command center in Europe. The reality was grim. Germany had lost an entire field army, something no general had imagined possible during the triumphant days of 1940. The defeat was more than military. It struck at the psychological foundation of German command. If this disaster could occur, what confidence remained in ultimate victory? Yet even after Stalingrad, Hitler pushed for one last massive offensive. The battle that followed, Kursk, stands today as the largest tank engagement in history. German officers knew the plan lacked the element of surprise, knew the Soviets had fortified their defenses with unprecedented depth, and knew the risks outweighed any hope of reward. But opposition had become dangerous, and few dared to challenge the man who held absolute authority over the nation. When the Kursk offensive collapsed, the last hope of regaining the initiative on the Eastern Front collapsed with it. From that point on, the German army fought a retreating war it could not hope to reverse. By the end of 1943, a quiet transformation had swept through the German officer corps. The bravado of earlier years was gone. In its place was a somber recognition of the inevitable. Industrial output was dwindling. Fuel shortages crippled operations. Allied bombers destroyed factories and cities alike. U-boat losses mounted at a rate no navy could sustain. In private conversations, many officers admitted to one another that defeat was not just possible but likely. Some even began to question their loyalty to Hitler, not out of moral awakening, though some certainly felt that way, but because they believed he was dragging Germany toward total ruin. The idea of removing Hitler surfaced more frequently as conditions worsened. To some, it was a desperate attempt to salvage what remained of Germany. To others, it was a moral obligation long overdue. Figures like Ludwig Beck, Henning von Treschow, and Klaus von Stauffenberg calculated that eliminating the dictator might save countless lives and give Germany a chance to negotiate. Their plans were bold, but the risks were staggering. The Gestapo seemed to lurk in every hallway and behind every closed door. A single misplaced word could cost a man his life. Still, the conspirators acted. Their attempt on July 20th, 1944, remains one of history's most daring efforts to stop a war from within. But when the explosion failed to kill Hitler, the consequences were catastrophic. Officers were arrested, interrogated, tortured, or executed. Others, realizing they were suspected, took their own lives before the regime could reach them. Those who had hoped for internal salvation watched helplessly as the opportunity slipped away forever. After the failed plot, any lingering doubts about the future evaporated. Germany's fate was sealed. The generals knew it. The soldiers sensed it. Even civilians, once shielded from bad news, began to understand the magnitude of the disaster. Still, the fighting continued, pushed forward by fear, by duty, and by the grim inertia of a war that had spiraled far beyond anyone's control. In June 1944, Allied troops landed in Normandy. German generals assigned to the Western Front recognized instantly that their position was untenable. Their divisions were under strength and poorly equipped. They lacked both reserves and air support. Hitler refused to allow strategic withdrawals or tactical flexibility. Commanders like Erwin Rommel and Günther von Kluge saw the writing on the wall. They confided to their closest aides that prolonging the war served no purpose except increasing the suffering of soldiers and civilians. But their appeals for negotiation were dismissed with rage. After the July plot, both men came under suspicion. Rommel chose death over trial. Von Kluge did the same. The officer corps was slowly bleeding from within, even as the enemies on both fronts pressed closer and closer. As winter turned to spring in 1945, the last illusions of survival dissolved. The Soviet army surged into East Prussia and Silesia, pushing millions of refugees westward in chaotic columns. The Western Allies crossed the Rhine and advanced with overwhelming strength. Germany's cities lay in ruins. Food supplies dwindled. Communications broke down. Yet Hitler, isolated in his underground bunker, continued issuing orders as though victory were still within reach. He demanded counterattacks by armies that had ceased to exist, commanded garrisons to hold cities long since abandoned, and insisted that civilians should fight to the last breath. More and more generals simply ignored him. Some surrendered their troops to the Allies rather than waste lives on futile battles. Others falsified reports to hide the true condition of their forces. A few held to their loyalty until the final days, but even they understood the war was lost. They obeyed not because they believed in victory, but because the collapse of discipline itself was too terrifying to contemplate. Inside Berlin, as Soviet artillery shook the ground and fires consumed entire districts, Hitler convened one of his final meetings in the bunker. Surrounded by maps that no longer matched the reality above ground, he finally admitted what many of his generals had realized years earlier. The war was lost, and there was no future left to fight for. Those present described him as a man drained of purpose, acknowledging the inevitable with the weariness of someone who could no longer outrun his own decisions. Days later, he was dead, leaving behind a nation in ruins and a military command that had long since abandoned hope. In the aftermath of the surrender, Allied interrogators listened as captured generals explained their version of events. Many claimed they had foreseen disaster early on. Some insisted they had tried to save Germany from Hitler but lacked the power. Others shifted blame onto the Nazi Party, the SS, or even the German people. Very few acknowledged their own responsibility. They spoke as though they had been passengers rather than architects of the war. The truth lay somewhere between self-preservation and genuine regret. The deeper tragedy was not simply that Germany lost the war. The tragedy was that many of its commanders recognized the inevitability of defeat long before the nation's final collapse, yet continued the fighting anyway. They followed orders they no longer believed in. They pushed soldiers into battles they knew could not change the outcome. They obeyed because obedience had defined their lives and identities, because fear silenced their doubts, and because the system they served made disobedience unthinkable. But within that system were also men who attempted the impossible, who risked everything to stop the destruction and end the war sooner. Their failure ensured that the conflict would drag on, consuming cities, armies, and millions of lives. When the end finally came in May 1945, it was not a sudden collapse but the culmination of years of dwindling hope and slow realization. A surrender not only of arms, but of illusions. Germany's defeat was not sealed in its last battles. It was sealed in the overconfidence of 1941, when victory seemed endless and caution seemed unnecessary. It was sealed when the generals mistook rapid conquest for lasting power, when they underestimated the resilience of their enemies, and when they placed faith in a leader whose vision was detached from reality. By the time the truth became impossible to ignore, the machinery of war had grown too large to stop. The generals who had once commanded with absolute certainty found themselves trapped within their own creation, powerless to alter its course. In the end, there was no single moment when the German officer corps accepted the war was lost. It happened quietly, privately, and at different times for different men. Some realized it in the snow of 1941, others in the ruins of Stalingrad, others still in the wake of the failed assassination attempt. But all of them eventually reached the same conclusion. The war they had once embraced with confidence had become a catastrophe they could no longer control. And yet they continued, not because they believed in victory, but because they could not imagine another path. In that contradiction lies the true tragedy of Germany's generals, the understanding that defeat was inevitable, and the inability to act upon that knowledge. The war ended not with the realization of loss, but with the surrender of a nation whose leaders had known the truth long before the world heard the last gunfire fade into silence.